Imagine this. Your SaaS company is about to close an important enterprise deal. The product has been approved, the pricing is accepted, the sales team is pushing to get the contract signed before the end of the quarter. Everyone thinks the deal is almost done, and then, during the legal review of the MSA or the DPA, the customer adds a very broad audit clause. The clause says that the customer may audit the provider's systems, premises, records, personnel, security measures, subcontractors, and internal processes at any time with very little notice, and sometimes with no clear limitation on frequency, scope, confidentiality, or cost. At first glance, this may look like a standard compliance clause, but in practice, it can become a major operational and legal problem. A customer audit clause is not necessarily a bad clause. In many SaaS B2B contracts, especially when personal data, security obligation, regulated customers, or critical services are involved, the customer has a legitimate need to verify that the provider is reliable. The real issue is not the existence of an audit right. The real issue is whether that audit right is properly controlled. A good audit clause should create trust, not operational chaos. So in this video, we are going to break down how to review, redline, and negotiate a customer audit clause in a SaaS contract without killing the deal. We will look at why customers request audit rights, what makes an audit clause dangerous, which parameters must be controlled, how to use documentation and third-party reports, how to deal with audit rights in a DPA, and how to rewrite a risky clause into a balanced contractual mechanism. Part 1. Why customers request audit rights in SaaS contracts. Before you redline an audit clause, you need to understand why the customer is asking for it. In B2B contracts, audit rights usually respond to 4 concerns. The first concern is contractual compliance. The customer wants to verify that the provider actually complies with the obligations set out in the agreement. These obligations may relate to security, confidentiality, service availability, data protection, subcontracting, incident management, business continuity, or disaster recovery. From the customer's perspective, the contract is not just a document. It is a risk allocation tool. If the provider promises to protect data, maintain security, host the service properly, notify incidents, and manage subcontractors, the customer may want a way to verify those promises. The second concern is regulatory compliance. Some customers operate in regulated sectors such as financial services, insurance, healthcare, energy, public services, or critical infrastructure. These customers may have their own legal or regulatory obligations to control outsourced service providers. For those customers, an audit right is not always just a commercial preference. It may be part of their own governance and regulatory risk management. The third concern is operational dependency. The more important the SaaS product is for the customer's business, the more the customer will care about resilience, continuity, data access, reversibility, security, hosting, and subcontracting. If the SaaS product is business critical, the customer wants to know what happens if the provider fails, suffers a security incident, changes infrastructure, loses data, goes down, or becomes unable to provide the service. The fourth concern is trust. A serious enterprise customer does not only evaluate the product, it evaluates the maturity of the vendor. A SaaS company that can respond clearly, calmly, and professionally to audit requests will usually appear more mature than a company that simply refuses everything without explanation. That is why the provider should not respond to audit requests with a brutal refusal. The better response is to build a controlled contractual architecture. The goal is not to say no audit in every case. The goal is to say yes, verification is possible, but only under clear, proportionate, and secure conditions. So now, part 2, why a broad audit clause can be dangerous. The danger of a broad audit clause is not only legal, it is operational, commercial, security-related, and reputational. First, there is an operational risk. If every customer can request a full audit at any time, the provider's legal, security, compliance, product, and engineering teams may be constantly interrupted. This creates internal friction, slows down the business, and can turn customer audits into an unmanageable burden. A SaaS company should not become an open building where every customer can walk in whenever they want. Second, there is a security risk. An audit may require access to sensitive information, system architecture, security policies, incident response procedures, access controls, hosting arrangements, penetration test summaries, vulnerability management processes, or internal technical documentation. If the audit is not properly controlled, the audit itself may increase the provider's security exposure. Third, there is a confidentiality risk. The provider may hold information relating to other customers, pricing models, product roadmap, internal security practices, trade secrets, intellectual property, or confidential business processes. A customer audit must never become a way for one customer to access information that belongs to the provider or to other customers. Fourth, there is a scalability risk. A SaaS provider may have thousands, hundreds, or thousands of B2B customers. If each customer negotiates its own audit regime, its own security questionnaire, its own evidence standard, its own reporting format, and its own audit frequency, the provider loses control over its compliance model. That is a major problem for scaling. Fifth, there is a commercial risk. If the provider accepts an unlimited audit risk just to close the deal quickly, the business may win revenue today but inherit operational and legal risk tomorrow. But if the provider refuses every audit request without proposing a credible alternative, the customer may lose confidence and the deal may slow down or fail. The key skill is not to accept or refuse blindly. The key skill is to convert unlimited audit rights into controlled verification rights. Part 3. The 5 parameters you must control. When reviewing a customer audit clause in a SaaS contract, there are 5 parameters you should always control. The first parameter is scope. The clause must define what can be audited. You should be careful with broad language such as any system, process, facility, subcontractor, record, employee, or document. This type of wording is dangerous because it gives the customer a very wide entry point into the provider's organization. A better approach is to limit the audit to what is reasonably necessary to verify the provider's compliance with specific material obligation under the contract. For example, the audit may be limited to security, confidentiality, data protection, incident management, service availability, or subcontracting obligation directly related to the SaaS service. Now, the second parameter is frequency. Avoid unlimited audit rights. A reasonable clause may allow one audit per calendar year, unless there is a verified security incident, a material breach, a regulatory requirement, or another exceptional situation. This protects the provider from repeated or excessive audit requests. The third parameter is notice. The customer should not be able to audit the provider without reasonable written notice. A common approach is to require at least 30 days prior written notice, except in genuine emergency situations, such as a confirmed security incident or a mandatory regulatory request. The fourth parameter is access. The audit should be conducted during normal business hours by qualified representatives under strict confidentiality obligations, and in a way that does not unreasonably disrupt the provider's operations. The provider should also retain control over access to systems, premises, personnel, and documentation. The fifth parameter is cost. The clause should state who pays for the audit. In most cases, the customer should bear its own audit cost. The provider may cooperate reasonably, but it should avoid accepting unlimited internal costs generated by the customer's audit process. A possible compromise is to say that the customer bears the audit cost unless the audit reveals a material breach by the provider. Part 4. Use documentation and independent reports before direct audits. One of the best ways to negotiate audit rights is to create a hierarchy of evidence. A customer may need comfort, but comfort does not always require direct access to the provider's systems, premises, or internal teams. Before allowing an intrusive audit, the provider should be able to respond through less intrusive evidence. This may include security documentation, written responses to questionnaires, technical and organizational measures, subcontractor list, data processing documentation, incident response summaries, business continuity summaries, disaster recovery information, third-party certifications, independent audit reports, or recognized security standards. For example, if the provider has ISO certification, SOC 2 reports, or other independent security documentation, those materials can often answer most of the customer's concerns without requiring a direct audit. The key idea is simple. A mature SaaS provider does not say no audit in every situation. It says first documentation, then independent reports, then a targeted audit only if strictly necessary. This approach protects both sides. The customer gets evidence, the provider avoids unnecessary disruption and uncontrolled access. Part 5. How to handle audit rights in a DPA. Audit rights become especially sensitive in data processing agreements. In a typical SaaS relationship, the customer may act as controller and the SaaS provider may act as processor under data protection law. In that context, the customer may need to verify that the processor complies with its data protection obligations. But this does not mean that the customer should receive unlimited access to the provider's infrastructure, systems, subcontractors, or internal documentation. There are 3 points to control. First, the audit should be limited to the personal data processing activities performed for that customer under the relevant SaaS service. The customer should not be able to audit unrelated products, unrelated customers, unrelated infrastructure, or unrelated internal processes. Second, the audit must not compromise security, confidentiality, trade secrets, intellectual property, or the rights of other customers. This point is essential. A provider cannot breach confidentiality toward one customer in order to satisfy another customer's audit request. Third, the provider should be allowed to rely first on documentation, questionnaires, independent reports, certification, and written explanations. A direct audit should be reserved for a situation where the customer has a legitimate reason to believe that the documentation is insufficient or where a regulatory requirement make further verification necessary. You also need to be careful with subcontractors. Some customers may try to obtain direct audit rights over the provider's sub-processors. This is often difficult in practice, especially when the sub-processor are major cloud providers or infrastructure vendors. A more realistic approach is to provide transparency over the sub-processors, contractual flow-down obligations, security commitments, notification mechanisms, and available compliance documentation. The customer needs assurance, but the provider needs a scalable and realistic subcontracting framework. Part 6. How to redline a dangerous audit clause. Let's take a risky clause. The customer may audit the provider, its systems, premises, records, personnel, and subcontractors at any time to verify compliance with this agreement. Here, this clause is dangerous for several reasons. It is too broad in scope, it contains no frequency limit, it contains no notice period, it includes systems, premises, records, personnel, and subcontractors without any filter. It does not protect the provider's confidential information, it does not protect other customers, it does not mention security restriction, operational disruption, it does not create a documentation first process, it does not allocate audit costs. A more balanced version could be drafted like this. The customer may, no more than once per calendar year and upon at least 30 days prior written notice, request information reasonably necessary to verify the provider's compliance with its material security, confidentiality, and data protection obligations under this agreement. The provider may satisfy such request by providing relevant documentation, security summaries, third-party audit reports, certifications, or written responses to a reasonable security questionnaire. Any on-site or direct audit shall be limited to matters not reasonably verifiable through such documentation shall be conducted during normal business hours by qualified representative bound by confidentiality obligations and in a manner that does not unreasonably disrupt the provider's operations or compromise the security, confidentiality, intellectual property, or rights of other customers. The customer shall bear its own audit cost unless the audit reveals a material breach by the provider. Now, let's break it down. No more than once per calendar year limits the frequency. At least 30 days prior written notice creates a clear notice requirement. Information reasonably necessary avoids fishing expeditions. Material security, confidentiality, and data protection obligations limits the audit to relevant obligations. The provider may satisfy such request by providing documentation, creates a documentation first process. Any on-site or direct audit shall be limited, makes direct audit exceptional rather than automatic. During normal business hours, protects internal operations. Qualified representatives bound by confidentiality obligations controls who conducts the audit. Does not unreasonably disrupt the provider's operations, protects the provider from excessive interference. Does not compromise security, confidentiality, intellectual property, or rights of other customers, protects the provider's ecosystem. The customer shall bear its own audit cost, clarifies the economic burden. This is the difference between an uncontrolled audit right and a controlled verification mechanism. Now, Part 7. Negotiation positions depending on the customer. Your negotiation position should depend on the type of customer, the value of the deal, the regulatory context, and the criticality of the service. Scenario 1. A small or standard customer. For a small customer, the provider should usually avoid custom audit rights. The recommended position is to provide standard documentation, standard security information, the standard DPA, the list of sub-procedures, and general contractual commitments. The provider should avoid creating a bespoke audit process for every small deal. Scenario 2. An important mid-market customer. Here, for a mid-market customer, the provider may accept a limited verification right, mainly documentary, with a reasonable security questionnaire, limited frequency, and proper confidentiality protections. This gives the customer comfort without creating an enterprise-level audit burden. Scenario 3. A large enterprise or regulated customer. Here, for a strategic enterprise customer, especially in a regulated sector, the provider may need to accept a more developed audit clause. But acceptance does not mean unlimited access. The clause should still include notice, limited scope, limited frequency, confidentiality obligations, documentation for process, protection of security information, protection of other customers, cost allocation, and operational safeguards. The more sensitive the customer's environments, the more legitimate the request for assurance may be. But the more extensive the audit right is, the more carefully it must be controlled. Part 8. Common mistakes to avoid. The first mistake is refusing all audit rights without offering any alternative. This can make the provider look immature or non-transparent. The second mistake is accepting unlimited audit rights to close the deal quickly. This may help the sales team in a short term, but it can create serious operational problems later. The third mistake is forgetting subcontractors and hosting providers. If the SaaS service depends on cloud infrastructure or third-party tools, the audit clause must be aligned with what the provider can realistically control. The fourth mistake is failing to protect information relating to other customers. A provider should never accept an audit process that could expose another customer's data, security arrangements, or confidential information. The fifth mistake is ignoring audit costs. A broad audit can consume significant time from legal, security, compliance, and technical teams. The contract should make clear who bears those costs. The sixth mistake is allowing the customer to appoint any auditor without restrictions. The auditor should be qualified, independent where appropriate, and bound by confidentiality obligations. The seventh mistake is failing to align the MSA, the DPA, the SLA, the security annex, and the subcontracting terms. If those documents contradict each other, the audit framework becomes unclear and difficult to manage. The eighth mistake is treating the audit clause as a purely legal issue. In reality, this clause affects legal, sales, security, engineering, compliance, customer success, and leadership. A good audit clause is a cross-functional clause. Part 9. A practical checklist. Before accepting a customer audit clause, ask these questions. What is the exact scope of the audit? Is the audit limited to the provider's relevant contractual obligation? Is the audit limited to the SaaS service provided to that customer? Is the frequency limited? Is there a written notice period? Can the provider respond through documentation or independent reports? Are the auditors subject to confidentiality obligation? Can the provider refuse or restrict access that will compromise security? Does the clause protect information relating to other customers? Does the clause protect trade secrets and intellectual property? Does the audit process avoid unreasonable disruption to operations? Who pays the audit cost? Is the clause consistent with the DPA, with the SLA? Is the clause realistic in light of the provider's, subcontractors, and hosting model? Is there an internal process to manage audit requests? If you cannot answer these questions clearly, the clause is probably not ready to be accepted. So, in conclusion, a customer audit clause is a strong indicator of contractual maturity. An immature SaaS provider either refuses it completely or accepts it blindly. A mature SaaS provider understands the customer's need for assurance, but transforms that need into a controlled, proportionate, and scalable verification process. In SaaS, the best audit clause is not the broadest one. The best audit clause is the one that gives the customer enough comfort without turning the provider into an open building. If you work on SaaS contracts, MSA negotiations, DPI reviews, FLA commitments, security questionnaires, or enterprise SaaS deals, this channel is designed as a practical contract review library for SaaS, privacy, AI, and digital business teams. The goal is not just to talk about legal theory. The goal is to understand the clauses that block sales, expose the business, structure trust, and shape real negotiations.